In this tutorial, I want to talk about the float property in CSS. We can apply the float to any HTML elements, and in this tutorial, I'm going to apply it to our image here so that our image is floating to the left of the page and that our text appears beside it rather than underneath it. If we just take a look at the HTML file we're working with, I have an image here and I have a paragraph of text. I've also wrapped everything inside this div tag as well. And what I might do is apply a background color to our div just so we can demonstrate how the float works. So I'll just jump over to our CSS file and write a background color rule for our div. And I'm going to give it a light gray background color. Let's save that, jump to the website. Great, so you'll see that everything is contained inside this div. And the div doesn't have any fixed dimensions, so it should just stretch and grow depending on how much content lives inside it. So now let's float our image to the left and see what happens. Back over in our CSS file, I'll apply the float rule to our image. Float left. Of course, make sure to have the colon and semicolons in the right place. So let's save that and take a look at what happens to our page. So our image is now floating left. You'll see our paragraph is sitting beside it, but you'll also see that our div, which we can visualize with this light gray color background, it's wrapped around the text only and not wrapped around the height of the image. So you're not seeing a big gray box here. It's just wrapped tightly around our paragraph. And that's because we're floating the image. So essentially it's now kind of living outside of that div container. It's kind of like a level up or a layer up, I guess you could say. So what we could do is maybe give our div a height, let's say a height of 500 pixels. Let's take a look and see what happens. So our div now has a fixed height of 500 pixels and our image is kind of looks as though it's living inside the div, but essentially that's not really what I want to do. I want to have this div more dynamic so that it stretches and grows in height depending on how much content is inside there rather than being constrained by the fixed height. So I'll just remove that height rule and jump over to our HTML file. And what I might do is actually create another div that we can play around with inside our first div and just under all our other content. Now, I'm not going to put anything inside this div, but what I will do is apply a class. And I'm going to call this class CLR. Let's save that. And of course, if we take a look at the website, we'll see that nothing's changed. Our image is still floating to the left and our div is still tightly wrapped around the paragraph. Let's head over to our CSS file, add the class name CLR, and now I'm going to type clear both. And let's see what happens. So what we've done is added a div that contains no content, but it has a CSS rule to clear both left and right sides, which means that this containing div now successfully has the dimensions of both elements inside it. So it nicely wraps around the paragraph and the image. So let's just take a look at the CSS. So we have our class name CLR, which of course, being a class name, it could be anything. And I've written clear both. And you can see our div here. It's empty, but it has the class name CLR, so it invokes that clear and essentially kind of pushes the height of the width to everything that's inside it. What I'm going to do is just delete that empty div for the moment, and I'll just jump in back to our CSS file and delete the clear here. Might also delete that float here. So the only CSS rule we're seeing in our style sheet at the moment is the background color of the div. I've just saved that. We'll take a look at the website. And we're kind of back to the start. So we have an image and text. Nothing's floating at this stage. I want to add another image into the mix. So let's jump over to our HTML file. I'm going to add a second image. Save that. So we have two images here. Now what I'm going to do is float this image to the left, and I'll float this image to the right. Now let's take a look at what happens. We might need to apply some class names to each image so that when so essentially we can't just say image float left, because that means both images will float to the left. So let's apply some class names to each of those images. Back in our CSS file, I might call this first image, and the second one I'll give the class name second image. Let's save that and jump over to our CSS file. Let's put the first class in, which was first image, and let's put the second one in as well. Don't forget that full stop to indicate that this is in fact a class. Oops, that should actually say second image. And we want to make our first image float to the left, and we'll make our second image float to the right. Let's save that and see what happens. So it's kind of like what we were seeing before. We have our images floating in their respective spots, and our text has fallen into the middle gap of those two images, and the div, you can see, is once again wrapped around the text, because that's the only element inside the div that doesn't have a float applied to it. So in order to get the background color, or in order to get our div nicely wrapping around everything, we need to add a clear. So I could do the same thing as before and add another div with the class name, let's call it CLR again, and we'll make it empty. I'll jump over to our CSS and make that class name inherit a clear both. And that certainly works. But perhaps I want this paragraph of text not to live inside the gap created by the two floating images, but to live underneath the images. So let's jump over to the CSS, and you'll see that we have a class CLR, which has a clear both. Let's apply that class name to our paragraph. So here's our paragraph in our HTML file. So I've just given our paragraph the class CLR. I'll save that, and let's take a look at the website. There we go. So we have images floating to the left, an image floating to the right. We have a paragraph of text, and our paragraph has the class name clear, so that way it kind of drops to underneath our floating elements. Now these images are kind of sitting a little bit too close to my paragraph of text, so finally what I might do is apply some margin to my images just to push it away from the text a bit. Let's jump over to the CSS file, and I want this to affect both our images, so I could put margins here on both of them. That would certainly work. Let's take a look. Yep, our images now have 30 pixels of margin around them, which kind of separates them from the edges of our div and also separates them from the paragraph. But there is actually a cleaner way to do this. Rather than type the same rule twice for each of our classes, why don't we just apply it to the image selector? So I'll delete that. Let's delete that one, and let's just apply a margin to the image selector. 30 pixels. So this way it will affect both images. I've saved the website, refreshed the page, and as expected, it certainly works. We're not seeing any change, but both images still have that 30 pixel margin. Let's jump over to our CSS sheet again, and maybe let's apply a margin to our paragraph tag. I'll say a margin of 30 pixels. Let's take a look and see what happens. So it's moved the text to the left, to the right slightly. Let's put a 30 pixel margin there. And if we take a look at our style sheet, we could actually merge these because they have the exact same styles here. So rather than have all these lines of CSS, we could simply add the paragraph to this rule here, just by putting a comma and then a P for paragraph. So we've just cut down all those lines of CSS into this one line of CSS here. So let's save that. And of course, when I refresh the page, we won't see anything different. So essentially, we've just done the same thing, but in less amount of lines. Now, it's interesting to note that while we have sort of visual paddings around our paragraph, left and right, it hasn't really done anything visually to the bottom of the paragraph because we're not seeing any change there. So maybe we want to, instead of add a margin, we could add padding to our paragraph. So I'll just remove the paragraph. Let's say padding 30 pixels rather than margin. And let's take a look and see how that affects our website. So our paragraph has a nice padding of 30 pixels. And our images still have margins of 30 pixels. Of course, don't forget our paragraph has a float class so that it appears under our images. So I hope that demonstrates the float class, and thank you for watching.